Welcome to Ask Sean, where I explore all sorts of questions about life, relationships, and being human. I'm Sean Slevin, a licensed professional counselor and a licensed marriage and family therapist. And if you have a question for me, you can submit that anonymously at asksean.org. So in this video, I've been thinking about the question of how do we know when to pause therapy? This came up in part because, kind of twofold, there was a recent article slash podcast episode I listened to, kind of talking about this, sort of about kind of when to quit therapy. And there were some interesting things in that. I'm maybe not going to link to it because I'm not trying to pick a fight or whatever. There's some things I disagreed with a little bit. They take a little bit of a different angle than I do. But it was helpful to listen to and to reflect on. But even more so, I recently had one of my clients who I've been working with for a number of years, and we had a session where that's going to be our final session for however long. And it was a really, really sweet, special time of just processing together, just all their growth, and they're really letting that sink in, and they were really thoughtful about just, they didn't want to just quit via email or something, like they wanted to really have a conversation about it, and about kind of them being in a place where they felt ready to kind of sort of leave the nest a bit, and I think it was so lovely because they really got to feel sort of my care for them and my celebrating kind of sort of this graduation of sorts, and kind of are talking about just sort of the nature of life and the door being open, to return, and so they're just, it was a really special time. And so that was recent. That's been in the past kind of several weeks here, and so I was thinking, it could be useful to do a video about how do we get clarity on, like, is it time for me to pause therapy? Now, I think to start off, there's an element to clarify, because there's different views on this, and these different views are really rooted in different approaches to therapy. And so, like, my bias is apparent in my videos, and is apparent even in what I've already said, and even how I'm framing the question. I'm framing the question in terms of, like, how do we know when to pause therapy? I'm not framing it in terms of how, when to quit therapy. And not that quit is a terrible word or whatever, but so kind of two broad kind of contrasting views here, and then to kind of go deeper into kind of where I'm coming from. So, one view would be seeing therapy and the role of therapist as more, I don't know, maybe more like kind of car mechanic, like you come in, something's broken, we fix it, and we send you on your way. There's a lot of problems I have with that analogy, actually, so that's maybe not the best analogy, I don't know. But the essence of it is, like, it's very sort of problem oriented, and when the problem is addressed, then therapy is, to use the clinical term, terminated. That feels nice and warm and relational, right? You're ready to be terminated. So, again, revealing my bias, but so this is going to tend probably to be more short-term oriented, although, this kind of perspective could, work with somebody for quite some time. But it's like, once sort of the original stated goal is met, then the kind of within that frame, it's like, well, we should end this working relationship because we met our goal. And, there's a place for that, right? Like, it's, and actually I would have some overlap even with that, right? Like, what do I say? I guess maybe I'll just kind of get into kind of sort of more kind of where I'm coming from. If you're new to this channel, I'm really coming more from what I would call sort of kind of a growth model. And I guess a sort of growth / lifespan model. I believe that we all need kind of mentors, helpers, guides, whether they be therapists or life coaches or, spiritual leaders, whatever they, I don't care what the labels are, but we all need people in our life who are further down the road than us, who can help us as we're progressing in our journey, right? Like, because here's the thing, like, none of us has arrived. Like, none of us is going to be done working on stuff. None of us is going to be totally healthy. None of us is going to be totally done building various life skills, right? Like, that's always in process. We're dynamic organisms, which is wonderful, right? Like, life would be so boring if we're static. If it's just like, okay, I figured everything out and I'm going to be exactly this for the rest of my life. That sounds like hell to me, like in like many senses of the word, like to be frozen in time like that, incapable of change. Shoot, like a lot of times we come into therapy because we're feeling so stuck, just that very language, harkens to like, we know deep in our guts, we're meant to have capacity to change. Like, and when we can't change it, we recognize like, this doesn't feel right. Like, I need someone help me to move forward. So that's, this is why I think in terms of pausing therapy, because I want the folks I work with to experience that, as long as I'm alive, right, that they could have access to me. I don't mean at all hours of the day and night. I'm very boundaried in that regard, but that I would love to work with them again if something comes up which they're like, oh, I could really use Sean's help. And so that looks different for different clients. I have some clients where the nature of their journey and of their life and of how they are working on their stuff is such that they really want, they want and they make good use of the consistency of seeing me on a regular schedule, whether that's weekly or every other week or whatever that may be. And so, we're not like just sitting around shooting the shit, eating bonbons, right? Like, there's work happening, and that can look lots of different ways. Like, not work doesn't have to mean like, weeping and wailing or whatever, and deep childhood trauma. Sometimes the work of therapy is like integrating and make sense of like what's good in one's life, what's happening well, what we're doing well. Like, that can be just as hard for a lot of us. So the work of therapy can, it can look so many different ways. So the question then is, do I feel a desire and a need for somebody like, like Sean, for my clients, it's the question of, do I feel a desire and a need to continue to be meeting regularly with him? And what regularity does that look like? One of the things I teach my clients to do is to really listen to their insides in terms of the frequency. And so I have clients that will ebb and flow from like weekly or even multiple times a week to very infrequently. Like, maybe we get on a schedule where it's every 4 weeks or every 8 weeks or something like that. And then in some cases it's like, okay, we're just, they'll reach out to schedule kind of a few here and there, and so I really like this because it really puts clients in the driver's seat. It really, this is a big part of my kind of sort of life philosophy, is I'm a big believer in like all of us learning how to take more responsibility for ourselves. I think this is where agency, true like healthy power, I would say, is rooted in I am responsible for me, and I have developed the capacities to actually like own that responsibility and make hard choices and really wrestle with, well, what do I need here? Do I want to schedule a session? Do I not? Do I want to cancel the session I have scheduled for next week and maybe wait a few more weeks? All of these kinds of things. And these can be hard decisions at times, and yet they're so important. It's important that we learn how to make those for ourselves, that we learn how to be in relationship with ourselves such that we can own that, right? Like, I don't think that's a thing that can be dictated, by any therapist. Now, as a therapist, like our therapists, our helpers, can offer suggestions and guidance, and so like when I'm working with clients, especially early on, they'll a lot of times ask, how often do you think I should come? And so I'll give them sort of my gut feeling. I'll say, well, based on some of what has come up so far and sort of how, kind of you're grappling with that and the intensity of that, I wonder if it might feel good to be coming, every week or every other week. Typically when folks are starting out, I'll be cautious about doing anything less frequent than every other week, just because it's hard to kind of get momentum, and if it's at the very beginning of therapy, usually it's useful to come with some regularity, every other week, or every week, just to kind of like, let's let's get some momentum going, and then we can, kind of drop back and space them out more. Um, but yeah, but even there, it's like I'm not dictating that. I'm like, well, this is kind of the feeling that comes up in me. How does that feel to you? Like, I'm already from the very beginning, I'm inviting them to like try to check in and try to evaluate, like, well, does that resonate? Like as Sean says that, are my insides saying, yeah, I think let's go with every other week, or no, I think actually I really want to come weekly, like that. I think I don't want it. Doesn't. I'm not wanting to wait 2 weeks, or and so it doesn't. There's no right or wrong. Like it's the goal is just like to notice those subtleties, or sometimes it's not so subtle things that happen inside us in our body and in our emotions that are like, this is what I think I might want and need here. And that's an ever evolving conversation throughout life, right? So it's not that it's not about a right answer. It's about, well, I asked the question of myself and I listened for an answer, and then I made a decision, and then I pay attention to how I feel about that. Sometimes I make a decision and I'm like, wait, actually, no, let's change that. It's like sometimes we have to make a decision in order to get more information about how we feel about something, and then, make further adjustments. So anyway, like, yeah, I got going off of, they're not exactly rabbit trails. I think this is all relevant, but trying to collect myself here on some additional places to go. So all of this is like laying groundwork, right? Like it's in the context of this that then I think about, right? How do we know when to pause therapy, right? Because again, I'm not thinking in terms of like, oh, this is a hard and fast ending forever, kind of thing. I just made my camera vibrate there. But yeah, it's like, it's not that, but it's like, okay, this is good for now. So one of my therapists who I worked with for a decade, who was so helpful to me earlier in my journey, he had this phrase that has really stuck with me. I love kind of the playfulness of it, because I asked him this question of like, well, how do I know like when or if like I should take a break from therapy? And one of the things he said to me was, he's like, well, when you start to feel like you have better things to do with your time, then come to therapy. And that's not meant to like, put down therapy in any way, but it harkens to this sense of internal desire. Like if we are starting to, and so I talk with clients about this, right? It's like, if you are starting to kind of, especially if you're starting to resent going to therapy, like, oh my gosh, like we want to catch this long before that, right? But if you're starting to dread it, that's a tricky one, because sometimes we can dread going when we need to go, but dread it in like like in the sense of like a felt sense of like, yeah, I don't really want to do this. I don't feel like there's anything I want to work on. I feel like it's been very minimal like work that I've been doing in therapy lately. Yeah, if the more that we're starting to think about like, I really wish I could use that time for XYZ, that really harkens to the phrase when you start to feel like you have better things to do with your time, kind of thing. Yeah, it's like we really want to pay attention to how are we feeling as we approach our therapy sessions. Now, this is complicated, right? Because, a lot of times in therapy, we're working on difficult trauma, and so there is going to be ambivalence there, right? There can be outright like dread, because the work is difficult. Even as we have lots of support, even as we're helping things heal, there can be an element of like, I don't want to have to do more hard work. So that's a different kind of quality, right? Than like a sense of like, I'm feeling really good. I'm not sure why I'm going. I'm not sure what I'm doing with it, right? Which is a great time to have a conversation with your therapist. Like I tend to, so I'm training my clients from the beginning to like be giving me feedback, and to like, so that this conversation happens pretty organically typically. But also I'm always kind of feeling things, right? Like if feeling things out. Like if I'm noticing that like, we've been meeting, we're still meeting every other week, and like it's not just that things are feeling calm. It's like, it's feeling like I'm starting to have a lack of clarity on sort of kind of where we're going and what we're doing with the time. Like if I'm feeling that, then it's like I'm wondering, is the client feeling that, right? Because that tells me there's not things coming up that like sort of are relating, in an immediate enough way to kind of things I need to work on, which again doesn't have to be like intense, like wailing and crying or whatever, right? It can be, work can happen in very subtle ways. But if I'm starting to kind of be like, I'm not quite sure what's happening here, what we're doing here, then it's like I need to get clarity at the very least on like, how is this feeling for you? What do you feel like is happening in our work here lately? There can be all sorts of important work that happen in these quiet times, but I may be feeling, a little, perhaps a little lost. And yeah, so it's like either way, like I'm between the client and I, like I'm wanting us to be like, I'm wanting us to catch it before either of us is just like, oh gosh, we're doing another one of these, like that's not, I don't want to feel that way. And that's not, I don't typically feel that way, in part because like I'm really interested in like let's show up and do something real, and again, that can look lots of different ways, but we've got to have something real happening here, right? And so yeah, if there's a lack of realness, a lack of presence, which typically is not going to actually, as I think about it, like that doesn't, I don't know that I really feel like I have that happen typically with clients who I've been working with for a long time, because it's like they get so real and so present, which is why I guess typically in my experience, clients are initiating, they initiate the conversation of like, yeah, I feel like I want to drop back. And I'm like, great. Like, let's talk about that. Like, tell me more about, kind of what you're feeling there. Like what feels right to you. Do you feel like you want to have still something scheduled regularly, but further out? Do you feel like it's important for you, for your psyche, to like not have anything on the schedule? Like, and so I just kind of walk them through that kind of, conversation with themselves. Yeah. So I thinking out loud here, I think it's more so if maybe early in the work with people, sometimes maybe if they've come into therapy, but they're not quite ready for the kinds of work that I'm, kind of oriented towards. There can be a little bit of like what are we doing here? Like, because maybe sometimes folks come to therapy. This doesn't happen as much anymore because I think I do a pretty good job on my website of like presenting what I'm really about. So I think, folks that are looking for what I'm about to describe typically are not going to even bother, applying or whatever, if you will, like, reaching out for a session. But yeah, earlier in my career, sometimes there would be times where I think folks, maybe they were hoping I could just give a fix, something quick and easy, something that wasn't going to require hard work. And so then there can be sort of this like muddled kind of avoidance, like, and so that can drift on for a long time if you let it. And so I would tend to try to like, kind of speak to that early. And just not to push them in any way, but just to kind of, I'm trying to invite engagement, trying to invite ownership, right? Because that's the goal here, is that people would own their lives, that we'd all take ownership of our own lives. And yeah, because I think that's where I think flourishing depends on that. Yeah, so as I think about it though, I think it's in that kind of, it's more so in that scenario. Like I can't really imagine, yeah, with people that I've worked with a long time. Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think about. I mean, we're all in process, right? So even if I've worked with someone a long time, there can still be places where it's like it's a growing edge to like to pause, that can still feel really risky and edgy for some, for some folks, for some of my clients. And that's okay. Like there's no shame in that. No, I mean, it's just, that's a hard area, right? Like there's the fear of like, oh, am I going to disappoint Sean? Right. Cause there is a sadness, like there's a delight in seeing folks feel ready to kind of step out further. But I mean, I love working with the people I work with. And so it's like, I'm going to miss them. I mean, that's part of the nature of my work. I mean, thinking back to like the session that I had recently where somebody was ready to pause therapy, one of the things they remarked upon is that, and that was so transformative in our work, is they talked about how they felt me as a real person in a way they hadn't with a therapist before. And that's to say I'm not the only one like this, right? There's lots of good therapists out there who show up as real people. But there's also, some models that are kind of detached, or folks who do therapy, who practice therapists who just, the way they do that is a bit more distant. And, in certain, maybe there's benefits to that in certain, contexts or certain circumstances. That's not how I'm built. I can't work that way. And so like, I'm very invested. Like I care and I show up as a real human being with, flaws and gifts. And so, that, and I leverage that for people's growth and healing. But like this client was, reflecting on how that had given them such a different experience of therapy and how impactful that was. And they were kind of tearing up and just as they were letting in how much me and our work together had meant to them. And I highlighted that for them because I've been practicing that in my own therapy. Like I'm letting my therapists matter more to me. I'm saying it out loud of like, you matter so much to me. This has helped me. You have helped me so much. I've come so far and I couldn't have done it without you. And to let that be true is very vulnerable and very risky. To let the good in, to let it be real. And I think, it's a nice marker about being ready to be able to take more distance, is that I can really take in the good, and I've really taken it and I'm owning it. It's like, this has been given to me and it's mine. Like I have been helped in these ways. I have been loved in these ways. I've been nourished and held and cared for in these ways. And that is going with me. Like, because again, that is the goal. I mean, if we think in terms of a developmental model, the goal is to expand into the world more and more. And that can look differently for different clients. Some clients, that part of what they need in doing that is they need to take breaks from therapy. And they need to pause and be without the therapist's presence for seasons, to really, as part of really sort of further solidifying, like, I've got this and this is in me and I know I'm loved and I know I can do this and I can do my life. Not that I have all the answers, not that it's all figured out, but I can continue to face life and, and show up and engage my struggles well. And then for others of us, like, the nature of our relationship with our insides and the stuff that we work on, we're like, no, I want that consistency. And that gives me a platform out of which then I go and I expand into the world and I have all these adventures. And so it depends, right? For one client, not pausing is going to get in the way of their growth. And for another client, pausing is going to get in the way of their growth, right? And so it's not there's no formula here. It is so much about feeling out the particulars of a given person. So again, coming back to this question, how do I know if it's time to pause? Again, the one kind of whimsical, somewhat snarky, like, well, do you have better things to do? Are you finding that like you really wish you could use that time in other ways? Well, that might be your inside saying, you know what, I feel like I've got enough for now. I want to go out and, live the adventure of my life a little bit more. I want to use that time, that hour and, hour plus, because there's travel time, or unless you're doing it, online, for other things. And so then, explore that, see what it feels like to try that on. Are there parts that get a little scared? How, can you work with those and reassure them that you're okay, and reassure them that you still can, reach out for a session if you need to, or you can resume regular therapy if you need to, and kind of, really listen to like, what do I need to do to honor that impulse? Like, what does that look like for me? And then, so kind of another category I was mentioning, right, is like that sense of like, I've really taken in and I feel full, like I've taken in and digested and owned a lot of good. And so like, with that, like, I'm just kind of want to take that with me and see where I go and see what happens. Right. And so that can be another, kind of impulse and call to, to pause. As I should also mention here too, so there's the layer, right, of finances. That kind of, and this is where constraints are helpful in that they, none of us have infinite resources. Doesn't matter how much wealth or not someone has. Like, we're always grappling with this question of like, well, everything's a trade-off, right? If I'm paying for this, I'm not can't afford to pay for that, like, and so that's part of the equation too, right? Like, so as we look at the overall, the big picture, right, of our life, the pie of our life, is there, this is kind of a variation on the, like, do I have better things to do with that time? Do I have better things to do with that money? Like, so I mean, I think about I have a lot of clients who are mental health workers. They're therapists of various kinds and whatnot. I have a lot of clients in a lot of the helping fields, medical field and teachers and clergy and yeah, but yeah, so like, I'll have clients who are mental health workers, and they'll be like, I'm going to pause for a bit because there's this training that I want to do that's over an extended time, and it costs a lot of money, and so they're like, that's the better thing they want and need to do. Now, there can be, a sadness there sometimes of like, in some cases they might be like, I kind of wish I could do both, but I got to choose, and this feels like the right thing for me. And so it's like, well, do that, like, absolutely, like, go and be challenged and enriched, and do that with the knowledge that you can come back, that my door is open to you, like, that's such a key thing. I mean, this is, again, thinking developmentally. I think about, like, young children who, they go up and they get cuddles from the parent, I mean, if this is, if they have a good parenting situation, get recharged, and then at some point they get squirmy and they want to, like, go venture out and explore again. And then at some point they've gotten a little too far away, and they're like, they come back and, get more goodies from the parent, like, kind of emotionally, somatically. And then, they've got enough and they get squirmy and they're ready to, go out and explore. And so, that pattern continues throughout life, right? Like, we're meant for this sort of expanding and contracting, expanding and contracting, kind of like a heartbeat, And so it's learning how to pay attention to that and move with that, right? And listen to, like, oh, I actually do. I need to kind of contract, and I need to be cared for a bit. Not in a like an unhealthy, spoiled kind of way, but like, I need some nourishment. And then being like, I'm feeling the call to, like, show up more in my life, and that requires time, energy, resources. And so I'm going to take some of that, from, going to therapy as often, or maybe, going to therapy at all, and put that over here. And then we listen to, like, when do we, like, I need to come in for, a session or two. Or maybe I need to, my heart is getting weary. I need to come back and kind of help myself, get some help in knowing myself, and what do I need here. And, like, so again, all of this is rooted in this principle of ownership, this principle of personal responsibility, right? Like, which I'm not saying is easy, but it's what I think what we're invited to aspire to. So yeah, let me think if there's any. I don't think there's any other categories here or barometers for, like, how to know when it's time to pause therapy. I'll probably think of some things later that can be in another video at some point. Yeah. But I think I've kind of covered the feel of what I wanted to get at. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's probably all for now then. Yeah, any closing thoughts? I guess, yeah, I mean, if you are, so if you watched this, this grabbed your eye because you're in therapy and you're trying to decide, is it time to pause? Maybe you've been in therapy for a while and something is coming up in you about pausing. Talk to your therapist. I mean, hopefully they're healthy enough that this isn't going to trigger them or something, If you're scared about it, that means it's probably a really good thing for you to do. Because this is part of the beauty of, like, pausing, is that often is muscle building in and of itself. Again, like I alluded to earlier, there can be, you might be afraid of, are you going to disappoint the therapist? is a therapist going to think, oh, but you're still so messed up or something? And, which again, if they're a healthy therapists, they're not thinking that, but we can imagine that story, right? You know, there can be, the worry of like, oh, I'm making a mistake. There can be the fear of like, there can be a little bit of a scarcity kind of thing of like, oh, what if I give up my slot and then I suddenly something happens and I really want to come back and I can't get in, and like, I mean, for me, in terms of how I do my schedule, like I try to, like, as best I can, to keep enough space that I can always work somebody in terms of, existing clients. And I try to be judicious about, taking on new clients and not like overpacking myself, which is tricky, right? Because I do like to help people, and I also need to eat. I mean, there's just the reality of, this is how I make my living. And, but it, yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of ways that I can't be available, right? Like me personally, I'm not accessible via phone or texting or those kinds of things. Like I have really firm boundaries and all that. In part because it's like protecting that kind of time outside of session enables me to be super present in session. And that's just part of my makeup and how I do things. So it's like, because of that, then it's like, if people need to get in, like kind of for like an emergency session, like I want to make that as possible as I can, or I'll squeeze someone in, to, kind of an overflow spots or whatever. But, different therapists do things different ways. And so the point is, talk with your therapist about this, right? Like, talk through and face that fear, right? If you're afraid, of like losing your slot and then not being able to have access to your therapist, if something came up in like a month, talk with them about that. Find out about how do they do things? Is it realistic that they'd be able to get you back in? Face that vulnerability. And because that can help you kind of wrestle through, okay, maybe I'm not quite ready to pause, because this is coming up. And so let me work with this then. This then becomes the work. This is part of the really cool thing, right? Is that having the conversation with ourselves and with the therapist about pausing can help us get clarity, because it can bring up things of like, oh, actually, I want to work on this, and then potentially revisit pausing, and so sometimes we do that for a while, right? Like we kind of bring up the question of pausing, it brings up stuff, and it's like, okay, no, not quite. Let me work with that. Let me help that work through. And it's like, we help that work through. And then it's like, maybe a different thing comes up. And so, and that's fine, right? Because the thing is, it's bringing up parts that want healing. So great. Okay. Work is happening. Healing is happening. Growth is happening. And then at some point, if it's like, oh, well, I engage the question and I'm like, yeah, no, that actually feels pretty good. That feels right. Like, I think I do want to pause. Like I think that is the thing I want to do. Then we have confidence in that, right? Because it's like, well, I've asked this several times, and there were times where it's like, it didn't feel quite right. I think that's one of the biggest takeaways here is, face the scariness of the question, and face it with your therapist or your helper, your guide, clergy, mentor, life coach, whomever it may be, right? Engage this question honestly and courageously of, I'm having some thoughts, I'm having some inklings about maybe pausing, some combination of where I'm at emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, and or, also just, life and financial constraints, like, the combination of all those things. Something in me is like, maybe I want to make a change in frequency, or maybe I want to pause entirely. And so just, have the conversation with them. That helps you practice having the conversation with yourself, and then listen to your insides, listen to your body, listen to your soul, really be curious there, and then try something, like some of my clients they'll start to be like, well, let me cancel next time, but we'll keep the one after that on the books, and they see how that feels. And then it's like, we start to maybe space it out a little bit more. And so again, it's really rooted in this, like, they get to own that. It's not me being like, well, we're done, so, get out. Like, that seems terrible to me, and I don't think there's hopefully no therapeutic model that would advocate for that, right? Like, Like it's, yeah. It's like it needs to, like, I mean, that just, yeah. That, I mean, how awful, right? It's like I bared my soul and like I don't feel ready to leave, but you're telling me I gotta go, right? Like, so it's like, yeah, we want to be able to own the choice, even if sometimes it's like part of the choice is like I financial constraints, and so I do need to taper off. We want to help, like I want to help the client own that, right? Like I want to help them navigate that from a place of agency, from a place of adulthood, from a place of groundedness, and not like feel like victimized by it, right? Like, because we always have choices to make. We have choices to make about how we're going to respond to our circumstances. We all have limitations. We all have hard things. We all have times where it's like, yeah, I feel like the boat's sinking right now. Like, how do I live well? How do I live honestly and authentically? And like, how do I show up for that? There's a whole lot of things that I can't control with that, right? But how do I show up well for that? So yeah, so there's all these different facets, and so risk having the conversation again and again and again with yourself and with your helper, your therapist, whomever it may be. And yeah, and then try something and see how it feels. You can always change your mind, right? Like everything is an experiment. So, well, until next time, peace be with you.